I haven't seen any of that yet here locally.
Yeah, it's a great idea, Jay. I've been pushing it. We actually put some money into helping rural groups with small portfolios who don't know to do a 4% deal because they're too small and their portfolios don't permit it. So we put up some money to help rural and NeighborWorks groups put those properties into a Joe concept on a single balance sheet and then bundle a 4% for that. And people first thought it was a great idea, but I've not been able to get it off the ground.
Yeah, too bad.
In fact, I should go back and talk to Rural Lisk and see what, they were interested, but I should see if they can help. Because there's no plan B for preserving those kinds of properties. If you've got, a 30-unit property, rural, what are you going to do?
Yeah. And the other model that seems to be holds quite a bit of promise is the Opportunities Community Group. I always get it wrong in Boston with the back office, collaboration.
Yes.
Consolidation.
I like the concept a lot. It's really hard. It's been very hard to implement, execute on. But NeighborWorks, as you may know, we share offices with them. We provided free office space to help them get going with that. Okay.
Let's step away for one.
Sure.
Harold, you're muted.
So I was saying that when we were looking for a picture to for the CHAM logo, like one we have in the PowerPoint, and we searched the NeighborWorks PR, the picture library, we found mostly pictures of either buildings or people, but not both together. And then I checked with a couple of our groups and found the same thing. There was a predominance of, and our message is all about people and buildings, right, and projects. And I thought, wow, this really underscores a kind of split in our approach to what we do, and we've got to unify that. And the pictures tell the story, right? So I was stunned how hard it was. I thought there'd be like a no-brainer to find that picture. It wasn't. But if you all have others in your library that you like better, send them to me. Jenny, how many people do we have on board?
$148 so far.
Okay. Well, it is 12 o'clock. I want to say welcome to the early birds, everyone who has joined us so far. We're going to give folks a minute or two to climb on board before, because it sometimes takes that long just to push all the right buttons to get in. And then we'll start.
Harold, you have 247 on.
Well, I think we should get started for to honor the tight schedule that we're on and having 240 something people already joining us. So I'm Harold Nassau, the board president of CHAM and director of asset management programs at NeighborWorks America. And I want to welcome you all to the second CHAM COVID response webinar. We'll be doing others over the next couple of weeks as well. CHAM, as most of you know, is a consortium of enterprise, LISC, NASLEF, the state equity funders, and NeighborWorks America. It's the only real professional home for asset managers for mission-owned rental and affordable housing. And we serve the double bottom line of both resident outcomes, impact, and financial sustainability. And in today's crisis, in the corona crisis, that is more important than ever. Both the mission end, the resident side, and the property end, survival is actually no longer a metaphor, but a reality. So the function that CHAM is performing has become pretty important. And I want to be talking a little bit more about some new programming that CHAM is doing later in the webinar. But today's webinar will be a little different from some of the others you all may have taken part in. And I know every one of you has listened to more webinars than you could possibly have imagined you're listening to. In the first days of the crisis, it was all about emergency response, best practices, hot tips, things to do, things not to do. It was essentially a shotgun approach, which is all we could do in an emergency. Now we have a little bit of breathing room. So we're trying to step back a little bit today and present to you two nonprofit developers who have developed a strategic response across their whole organization and start to connect the dots between all the things that we were trying to and all have been trying to do the last weeks. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Jay O'Grady, Senior Program Officer at LISC, who will be our moderator today. Jay? Jay, you're muted.
And I've got to unmute myself. Technology challenge, first one of the day. So welcome everyone, and thank you for participating in this very important webinar. As Harold mentioned, my name is Jay O'Grady. I'm a Senior Program Officer with the Local Initiative Support Corporation, otherwise known as LISC. And on behalf of LISC, and as a former Director of Asset Management for one of today's presenters, I'm pleased to moderate this webinar. LISC recognizes that the COVID-19 crisis threatens to become a perfect storm for our partners' affordable housing portfolios. Spiking unemployment has led to an uptick in delinquencies. Some tenants have become increasingly food insecure, so we can expect many of those to prioritize expenditures on food over rent moving forward. The economic loss associated with unit turn times has increased as prospective tenants have become less mobile and as fewer applicants can demonstrate active employment. In cases where tenants themselves have experienced COVID, unit cleaning procedures have proven to be expensive. And the imperative to provide a safe environment for all tenants has become all-consuming to our housing partners. All of these challenges must be faced by asset management, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you the asset management leaders of two groups, which, while differing in portfolio size and geography, are in fact meeting these challenges head-on. And I look forward to hearing their stories today. We have two groups. There's One Neighborhood Builders, which is a community development corporation based in Providence, Rhode Island. They have a smaller portfolio of about 350 units or so. And then there's REACH, Community Development Corporation in Portland, Oregon, which has about a 3,000 unit portfolio. So the presenters today, I've introduced myself. At the bottom, we've been introduced to Harold, and Harold, as he said, will say a few more things about CHAM at the end. From One Neighborhood Builders, who will be presenting first, we have Steve Kearns, who's the Director of Asset Management and Operations, and Antonio Rodriguez, who's the Assistant Director of Asset Management. And then from REACH CDC, we have Brian Beeler, who's the Director of Asset and IT Management, and Melissa Baker, Portfolio Asset Manager. Our sponsor today, and we want to thank them immensely, is NeighborWorks America, who have been on the forefront of asset management ingenuity for years now, and we thank them for their support of today's webinar and for CHAM in general. A couple logistics. On the right-hand side of your screen, you will see that there is a Q&A feature. Any questions that you would like to ask of any of the participants today, we'd ask that you enter them in the Q&A section and not use the chat section. The Q&A section will be curated, and there will be time for discussing whatever pressing Q&A questions are asked as the presentations go along. At the conclusion of this, we'd ask that you fill out the webinar evaluation that will be presented to you when you leave the WebEx meeting. Your feedback is important, and we do ask you to fill that out. And finally, the webinar slides that we'll see today will be available. You can expect an email in the next couple of weeks that will have the slide deck for these. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Steve Kearns from One Neighborhood Builders, the Director of Asset Management and Operations. Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jay. Welcome, everyone. We're happy to be here today to give you our story on how we are dealing with the COVID-19 strategic response. It's been a challenge for all of us, I know, to get through this. And so we early on recognized that this was going to be a very serious challenge for all of us. So what we ended up doing was getting three areas of intensity that we wanted to talk about. Could you go back one slide, please, Jay? I just want to give a quick background on our organization. We generally operate out of 2 neighborhoods in Providence. We have 10 separate LPs that we're the managing partner on, and plus a variety of wholly owned properties as well. First Realty Management is our management agent, and they manage the 363 dwelling units and 12 commercial units that we have. And the projects are scattered throughout the entire portfolio of 122 buildings. I'd like to have Antonio Rodriguez join me and explain a little bit about how we approach the crisis and some of the background information regarding that. Antonio?
Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it. I'm seeing that number of participants continuously grow, and that excites me. I see so many people just hungry for this information. So to dive into the crisis recognition strategy that One Neighborhood Builders implemented, we kind of broke it down into 3 major components with a few subcomponents to each one. Our first component had to do with the information. During this time, information, access to information is very important, and we believe that a clear line of transparent and timely information sharing between One Neighborhood Builders, property management, and the residents is key in this, and that works together with the second component, which is communication. It's been difficult for everyone. It's been very difficult for property managers to be sort of on top of their game, asking for rent when people are going through a crisis. So, we thought it best to deliver a message with a little bit of compassion. And all our communication that goes out from One Neighborhood Builders and the property management company has a lot of compassion just in the language. And lastly, our last component, our third component would be our partnerships. This is a time that has really shed a light on the partnerships and the collaborations that housing developers have, not only with their property management companies or their partners, but with the residents themselves. The only way that we're going to figure ourselves out of the COVID is as a collective and through partnership. So we think that that's really important to lean on those and to invest more into partnerships. To dive a little bit more into each of the components, I'm going to go into a little bit more in detail. As a reminder, the first one was information. Information was monitored starting in mid-January for us. Once the situation looked like it was going to be taking effect across the country, we decided internally that it was time for us to start having the conversations, within the asset management department, within the organization, as a whole and with the property managers. By about the middle of March, we had decided, like most people, to close our offices to the general public, but continue to serve to the best of our capacity virtually and remotely. We continued to gather the data remotely and run our analysis all the way into mid-April. So it took us probably a good 2 to 3 weeks to analyze all the information and really dive into forecasting the cash flow impacts from April to the end of 2020.
Antonio, one thing I wanted to mention, that as you said, we shut down the offices, our offices in FRM shut theirs down, but we know that FRM and ourselves are working remotely. And if you want to mention a few things that FRM has been doing to keep in touch with the residents and keep their operations going remotely, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for bringing it up. I think it's very important as we head into the next slide and we start talking a little bit about communications. You guys will see on the slide here just a list of our partners that we work with. The first one being First Realty, which is our property management company. And I just want to highlight some of the things that they've done in response to the current crisis. In terms of rentals and our turnovers, they've moved to a completely virtual lease-up process. They're doing virtual tours of our apartments, and they're using a combination of communal key passing, if you will, or key boxes on site. So they went from on-site, in-person lease-ups to doing it virtually almost instantaneously. When it comes to communicating with our residents, I think they've gone above and beyond what we could have asked for. They do weekly calls with our tenants, not only to remind them of their responsibility, but really to just do wellness checks, to do health checks, to make sure that our residents have access and the information to any resources that they may need. And we wanted to make sure that they got that on a consistent basis. And lastly, in terms of maintenance, our maintenance staff is small, but they're strong. They've moved to do a 7-day-a-week schedule. So they're on basically all the time, and we greatly appreciate their efforts and their commitment to making sure that the residents are safe, the common areas are clean, and they're just performing well. So I just wanted to highlight that out of all of our partners here. I just wanted to highlight them really quickly, give them a little bit of some props in this time because they really stepped up. Another important component of the communications is the medium in which we communicate. I feel that for a long time, a lot of community development has been a little bit old school, and it's a lot of leaflet, handouts, a lot of paper, a lot of trees being cut down in order to get information out to people. We decided, because we were virtual and remote, that we would invest some resources into easy texting and Callfire, which are a free text messaging and free voice messaging app that allows us to get in touch with our tenants in real time, get them information that they need, and allows them to communicate with us directly. Since the launch of both of the platforms, we've distributed, this says 6, but we've actually distributed 7 text messages, and later today we'll have distributed our second voicemail to over 600 individuals and families, which include 1NB residents and community members at large. Our retention rate to the service is really high. We've only had 5 people opt out of the service, so we're definitely seeing a need for this type of communication, and it's something that we're going to be exploring and leaning into a little bit more moving forward, which I think a lot of us are going to have to do in order to stay in touch with our tenants and our community moving forward. The last part of our communication process would be the utilization of our resident services and an increase in the capacity and the responsibilities of our in-house resident services coordinator. It just so happened that in March, we hired a full-time resident services coordinator, not in response to COVID, but we definitely count it as a blessing in disguise. Our resident services coordinator has been amazing. She's also a community health worker, and her fellow community health workers have had a great impact on not only one neighborhood residents, but community members at large. Over the course of the past couple of months, they've helped over 150 families receive financial assistance for rent, utilities, and medication. We've helped over 70 families receive emergency food assistance, and we've helped over 100 families receive an additional financial assistance specifically for rent payment. So I think that is a victory in and of itself, and it really speaks to the impact that having a person on the ground communicating with the residents and being the direct link between our organization and the residents. You know, part of our mission is to provide a vibrant, healthy, and safe home, and I think we're able to do that with the help of our RSC. The last slide that I'll get into before I hand it back off to Steve so he can talk about the financial analysis portion of this is just our flyer. This was the flyer that we put out in in mid-March probably, just to let tenants know that, you know, these are the resources that we know are available to them. These are the resources that we can connect them to directly. And if they needed them, you know, we wanted to make sure that they got them as soon as possible. We felt that food, unemployment, or financial assistance and health were the key resources that people would be seeking at this time. So those are the ones that we shared with everyone. So I hope that you guys were able to gain some information and learn a little bit from what I spoke about. I'm going to hand it off back to Steve so he can talk, like I said, about the financial analysis and sort of our strategy, our proposals, and the outcomes of the conversations that we had with our funders. Steve?
Thanks, Antonio. You'll see again, I just put up our partners one more time just because two of them in particular we've been working very closely with. First Realty Management that Antonio mentioned before, and also Rhode Island Housing, which is our local housing funder, and has been working with us in terms of dealing with trying to find solutions to the deficits that we may be coming up against with the decrease in rental income coming in. So what we did was we met with Rhode Island Housing, and they mentioned we talked about some solutions that may come into play if necessary when we do an analysis on how our properties are doing financially. So one of the first things they mentioned was that we could suspend our deposits to replacement and operating reserves, which would give us an additional boost, and then be able to use the operating and replacement reserve to supplement operations on a better ratio than they had in the past. In addition to that, they mentioned we could, in particular cases, request debt forbearance agreements if they became necessary. And these payments would be added to the end of the amortization schedule so they would not impact cash flow on the near term, and we wouldn't have to worry about a payback of the forbearance for quite some time. And then finally, suspension of the distribution payments that come from the waterfall and keep those in the operating account so that it'll supplement our cash. And what I'd like to do is walk you through a couple of our properties. The first one is Adelaide Apartments. On the left-hand part of your screen, we sent to Rhode Island Housing a laundry list of requests for all of our portfolios, all of our properties in our portfolio. And I'm just highlighting a couple here to see how this worked out. So in Adelaide Apartments, we requested a 6-month debt service forbearance effective on June 1st. And then we suspended, and also a suspension of the replacement reserve deposits and operating deposits effective May 1st. And then at the end of the year, just replenish those reserves with the cash flow that was available at the end of the fiscal year. The other property is in a better cash position, has more units, and so the immediate suspension of reserves was not necessarily anything we might have to do, but when we look at the analysis later on, you'll see it may end up being necessary. And this, the NOP, which is the Neighborhood Opportunities Program, is a subsidy that we get as a supplement to a reduced cash flow by having tenants at 30% of area median income or below. So that's another option for us to increase those payments. And also, we were seeking a release of up to 50%, up to $500,000 from the operating reserve that would allow us to take care of some of the deficits that we may be seeing. And again, this would be replenished in the same manner as above. So if you look at what we did was, you have the very top line is the collection rate that we had March and April were actual rates. In March, we had a good collection. We always have a pretty good collection in March because people are getting their tax returns back and they're able to catch up on some of their rents. April, we were at 83% in this particular property. And overall, in April, we were at about 86% on portfolio-wide. Our vacancy rate, the next line down, has been low throughout. We're expecting it to be low throughout the rest of the year because people are not inclined to want to move in this kind of economy. So what we did was we decided to say that if our collection rate was at 75% the balance of the year, how would that impact us? It may go up and down. We know it's going to go up and down. We're hoping it will stay at about 75% at the least because we've seen reports in the New York Times where collection rates are going down as low as 50%. We haven't seen that yet, and we hope we never do. But at this point, we wanted to model something that would give us an idea of what we might need to do and might need to request from Rhode Island Housing down the road. So you see finally, we have the tenant portion of the rent, the subsidy portion, other income, and then you have your net income on the bottom. And then on the cost side, we have our total operating expenses as the first line, and then all the other portions of the that impact the cash flow, the escrow payments and replacement reserve payments, and the capital expenditures down the left-hand column. And we spread those out over the year and see what kind of an impact these would have. So you can see in January, February, actual, we actually had a negative 481 in cash flow, which is not unusual during the wintertime to have a little bit of a negative cash flow, and generally they would pick up during the summer. However, this being an unusual circumstances with the COVID, we see that if our collection rate remains at a low level, that our deficits are going to be increasing over the course of the year and could potentially reach, we're showing here, at 53,000 negative at the end of December. So what we did was, this is the same slide as the other one, or if you notice on the red in the middle of the page, we took off the hard debt service. Starting in June, we did stop paying our hard debt service, and then in the next two lines down, where the escrow deposits are made, we stopped paying the operating reserve deposit, and then in May, on the replacement reserve deposits, we put that at zero as well. And then in addition to that, in this particular property, we decided to reduce the amount of our proposed capital expenditures because this property is at the end of its compliance period and we'll be refinancing this in the next year or so. So we felt we would be able to reduce the amount of capital expenditures normally we would be having there. And you can see by the end of the period, the property does end up having a positive cash flow by making those adjustments. And again, this is all fungible. We can change these things as if the collection rate increases by the fall, or in some respects we can change these. The next property is Villa Apartments, which has a little better cash situation. And you can see here, we did the same thing. We had the project had a 93% collection rate in April, and then we leveled it off to 75% across the board. And this particular property has that neighborhood opportunities funding that comes in quarterly. So you see in June, September, and December, the income numbers, the total income numbers are greater than the rest of the time. On the expense side, and again, you have your total operating expenses across the top, and then you had debt service, your escrow payments, replacement reserve deposits down the side there. Again, the cash flow, you can notice, starts at a positive 48.35 in March, the cumulative cash flow, and then by the end of December, we could be as low as a negative 50 if we don't take some action. So these are the proposals we're planning to do. So in this case, we are anticipating addition to the operating account from the operating reserve of $27,000 in October. You see in the middle of the page there in the red. And then we did have to reduce the replacement reserve deposits in order to keep our takeout from the operating reserve to below 50,000. So we added another 15,000 in December, but it adds up to about 42,000. So we didn't have to get into beyond the 50, but we did have to suspend the payments to the replacement reserve. Again, at the end of the year, it got us to about even as far as the cash flow is concerned.
Hey, Steve.
Yeah.
You've mentioned the suspension of the replacement reserves a few times, and I know I've seen it on the chat. If you could just briefly explain what our strategy was and how we were able to get that. People are just wondering if it was something that we decided or if we had to ask permission of any of the funders involved or anything.
Right. Yes. What we did was two things. One is we met with Rhode Island Housing, who holds our mortgages on these properties, and they also monitor the compliance of the limited partnerships. In addition to that, the NEF National Equity Fund, who is the limited partner in many of our properties, had sent their quarterly reports. They had specific questions related to COVID-19 in terms of how we were going to deal with a lot of the issues that were arising. So we laid out to them the strategies that we're laying out to you here today to see if that would be acceptable to them. I haven't heard back from them yet, but that was sent to them so that they would be able to stay in knowing what we were doing and what we were proposing to do. We haven't had to implement any of these other than the suspension of the deposits. This was something that Rhode Island Housing said that they were able to do for us, and so that's how we worked that out. And they are the ones who actually take the funds directly from our accounts into the deposits, so they were able to control that as well. So this next slide is what we wanted to do in terms of delinquency tracking, because if we were going to run into trouble, we wanted to know ahead of time so we could inform our funders and people who had our mortgages, and so that we may have an issue. So what we asked the management company to do is to give us a list of every week of the month as it went by, what were the delinquencies so far for the month. As you can see, the Adelaide Apartments, which is on the first line, and on May 4th, showed payments only, or delinquency of $21,000, which is a 23% collection rate. Now, by the 25th of the month, you can see down the column there, we got up to 88% collection rate. However, the Villa Victorian, the one down the bottom we were modeling before, came in with an 84% collection rate at the end of the month, by the 25th of the month. So this is another tool that we use to monitor and to give us a kind of a heads up if something is going to be problematic down the road, so we can alert the folks who need to be alerted. And finally, this is another tool that we ask our management company to prepare for us. It's basically a down and dirty cash flow, where we say, how much money do we have in the bank? What are our current payables? What's our debt service, escrow payments, and are we going to be able to make all of those? Unfortunately, this is on 5/8, and We're preparing some further ones. We try to do this on a weekly basis. And this helps us to give us a heads up on a kind of conditions of concern that we may have. So in summary, just wanted to say that, staying on top of this from the get-go with good information and assistance from all our partners and assistance from our staff. We've been able to stay on top of it so far. We know this is a long slog and we're not out of it yet, but you just have to stay vigilant. So back to you, Jay.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Antonio. One question that I wanted to ask, in one of your earlier slides, you listed on the left-hand column all of the properties that One Neighborhood Builders has an interest in, and a set of interventions that you were thinking of pursuing to stabilize cash flow. When you met with Rhode Island Housing, your first debt holder and primary housing finance agency in Rhode Island, did you present all of those solutions to them as a package, or just are you just doing this on a one-off basis as needed?
We did present it as a package. We gave them the whole list of all our entire portfolio, and we did the analysis that I showed you here for each one of the properties. And so each one had a little bit of a different twist to it, whether we took more out of the operating reserve or had to go for more debt forbearance or that kind of thing. So they wrote back to us and answered each of the requests on an individual basis for each of the properties that they monitor. So yeah, it was done as a package, and then they got back to us on an individual basis and pretty much approved all of the requests that we made. They've been very cooperative, very helpful.
Thank you. Harold, did you have any questions that you've curated from Q&A at this point?
There have been a number of questions that you just addressed, Jay. And people want to see the slide deck. We will have it within a couple days available, including the communications platforms. People want to see, there was a request to see those particular sources. And Antonio, we should put up contact information for those sources. The people were interested in the quick and dirty cash flow, as was I, because I thought that the whole presentation showed two big changes. One, how you manage your manager in terms of weekly management review rather than our typical monthly management review, and how you manage your partnership with the finance agency of giving them weekly updates on your cash flow rather than the monthly or frequently quarterly data that they normally receive, so that the partnership was built on a far deeper database. It's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So at this point, then, we will advance along to our next organization, which is Reach Community Development Corporation in Portland. Brian Beeler, again, is the Director of Asset Management and IT, and I will turn it over to Brian. To advance.
Thanks.
There we go.
Yeah, Brian Beeler with Reach Community Development, Inc. We are a nonprofit CDC that operates in Portland, Oregon. Established in the 80s as a neighborhood nonprofit working to preserve affordable housing in South Portland. As we've grown since the 80s, we've expanded outside of the Portland region to include Clark County in Southwest Washington and Washington County, which is a suburb just outside of Portland, just to provide some of the diversity in that portfolio location. We're just crossing 3,000 units owned and managed with a currently set up a new project we have in Portland. Our portfolio is an active mix of tax credits, expired tax credits, HUD financed properties, as well as a collection of Reach-owned properties that have no other stakeholders in them that we keep affordable for mission reasons. Community context for organization is we run quite a few multifamily residential properties. We have about 45 different buildings that range from 200 plus unit single building entities to a scattered site portfolio of single family homes and duplexes of about 119 units. So it runs the gamut, as well as with the income restrictions serving 60% below AMI, as well as having projects that are designed to operate as permanent supportive housing, and income figures are closer to 30% on that. And so we've developed quite a few strategies focusing on opportunities within reach and things that have been illuminated because of the COVID crisis. And I will pass this off to Melissa to begin talking a little bit about what we do in the organization.
Great, thank you so much. Happy to be here. And so I think this is a nice complement to the first group, in that we also, our portfolio priorities really focus during this time on financial opportunities and equitable service for our communities and our residents. So we wanted to strategically plan for COVID-related activity with an eye to our long-term financial and physical sustainabilities for both our buildings and our residents, to ensure that our properties can maintain stable operations beyond the unknown term of our current health crisis. So we created a portfolio tracker that enables us to do a clear trend analysis and a portfolio snapshot for both our operations team on the property management and asset management side, and also for our board of directors and our committees, to give a clear sense of where are our challenges and where are the opportunities. We also adjusted our community support and resident services focuses during this time, and we'll talk about that after sharing more on the financial side. So here is just a brief snapshot of our tracker that has our entire portfolio and also has more categories than this. Some of the metrics that we're tracking include our reserve and cash balances at the property level. We wanted to explore the percent of rent that comes from subsidy, because this is going to be a good indicator for us about where the risk is on the revenue side. If a property has low levels of subsidy, the likelihood that the residents experiencing economic hardship will be unable to pay rent increases. We also are looking at our population served. This gives us a nice, clear snapshot of where our 60% households live and where our more vulnerable populations are, where our permanent supportive housing units are. A couple of examples to just pull out from here. Allen Fremont 64-unit senior property has 50% of the rental income from subsidy sources. That has been stable in terms of our rent collection because of those metrics. In contrast, McAllister Village 48-unit family and general community property is only subsidized for 7% of the revenue. That is going to see a lot more fluctuation. We are already seeing that trend, but we anticipate that will continue. And finally, Prescott Place is a fully subsidized HUD property, and so we are confident that revenue will stay consistent. So our opportunities are really going to depend on the property structure, and it's going to include working with partners to access reserve funds to meet debt service and critical operating expenses, specifically at our properties with low subsidy levels. An example of this is that we are working with our state agencies in Washington and Oregon to, on the properties that have long-term must-pay debt, to talk through loan deferral options to keep the property operating account as flush as possible, and then to extend the terms of those long-term loans. We're also able during this time to prioritize out-of-unit capital projects funded by reserves, or in the case of HUD properties, residual receipts, to address capital needs at the properties where we have healthy subsidy levels. And finally, we are engaging with local agencies to restructure our long-term debt at a lower interest rate, taking advantage of the current marketplace, specifically at our REACH-owned portfolio. And this will allow us to bring capital back to the parent company and to establish that flexible reserve that can support portfolio sustainability rather than project-specific sustainability. Finally, the final part that I will be presenting before turning it back over to Brian is the way that we have adjusted our resident services and community support. Historically, our resident services offerings were consistent across our portfolio, but in the midst of COVID-19, we have really targeted the attention for resident services at a portfolio scale. We are focusing on food provision and expanding food pantries to ensure access to food specifically for our most vulnerable community members. And additionally, we are emphasizing property and population-specific engagement, prioritizing healthcare, internet connectivity, and transit needs for our vulnerable residents. This is ensuring a lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion on the community engagement and support that we can offer. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Brian.
Yeah, thank you. It was well summarized on our portfolio. I would add that the COVID crisis has illuminated, as we're all aware, some of the inequities in portfolios that exist. Different residents in our different populations have different needs. So focusing on ways to rectify this situation moving forward and making sure that there's equal opportunities available for all of our residents and opportunities that are also specific to the needs of those populations is growing in importance. And one of the areas that was highlighted is the need for equitable internet access across our entire portfolio. On our newer developments, we've been building in quite a bit of Wi-Fi access point support and Wi-Fi networks for those communities that didn't necessarily exist in the aging portfolio. So we've taken this opportunity during this break while our community areas are closed, and we're reassessing how we move forward and how we move forward with a better, stronger portfolio for our residents than what happened prior to COVID. It's allowed us to go out and take a look at opportunities like this. And so there's many groups or associations affiliated with being able to help purchase and procure bulk need items for portfolios, such as Housing Partnership Network has a select program for purchasing. There's other ones available as well, but encouraging you to take a look at bulk purchasing opportunities or things that we can do to retrofit our portfolio that involve more minimal resident touches and bring a lot of benefit across the portfolio. So this was a strong kind of outcome of this crisis, is our desire to make sure that everyone has access to the internet for telehealth care or reaching out to family at times during isolation. It's growing apparent that this is an extremely important thing that we have an obligation to provide to our community. This ties back together in the organization with resident services, where we're having discussions about changing the model of graduation rewards for our program participants to move away from more of a gift card-based model to providing tablets and tech as part of that graduation process, and then having access to the free Wi-Fi in the buildings will help minimize chances that residents are isolated within the community or within their unit. Another issue that came out of this that ties nicely into the things REACH was working on in terms of energy efficiency and product conservation is retaking a look at our common areas and trying to come up with improvements that limit the number of touches that residents have to have in those communal spaces, as well as meeting the prior goals that we mentioned of conservation of resource and energy. And so that involves taking a look at common areas, including bathrooms, and pricing out, again, in bulk while these community areas are closed, purchasing automatic sensor lights, meaning that we're going to be using less energy in those common areas only when people are in there, and eliminating the touch to find and fumble for that light switch, as well as updating bathrooms to have automatic dispensing soap and running water. This, again, will have improvements in the conservation area, as well as limiting touches, which is especially important in our more vulnerable communities. We have quite a few senior projects, senior disabled, and the more that we can do to assist in this area and limit the chance of contracting COVID is good for all involved. And just again, I know it seems like a tough time for the industry, but there's always times to recognize these opportunities as we kind of slow down. I know CHAM has much more coming down the pike in terms of learning specifically around things that can help support these goals. Melissa did a good job of outlining those financial opportunities that might already exist within the portfolios, even down to maybe taking a look at on projects where you might be able to extract some money back to the parent organization, taking a look at agency financing, which is typically, been a little bit more expensive and taken longer to close, but allows you the opportunity to pull some cash out back to the parent organization to support COVID. And just as Melissa highlighted, again, continuing to identify those continuing capital needs and specifically focusing first on bulk retrofits that you might be able to better source for better cost per unit, as well as providing an opportunity to look out for grant funding sources to help support bringing internet equity to your communities, as well as limiting touches in common areas. And that is all I had on that. If we have any Q&A questions.
So, Brian and Melissa, thank you for that presentation. The one question that I had after hearing this presentation is with regard to your targeted resident services. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about how those resident services are funded. They might be funded in some properties above the line and others maybe from organizational resources. Now that you're shifting to less of a property focus, but more of a portfolio focus, has that funding structure in place been adequate, or have you had to modify there?
Sure, I can go ahead and take that. We are in a really fortunate position to have many properties that do have above the line resident services to support programming at those individual properties, which is phenomenal. Additionally, we have properties that consistently on an annual basis bring flexible capital back to the parent company of REACH. And so we allocate a portion of those resources to provide resident services at all of our properties across the portfolio, whether or not they were integrated into the project structure at the beginning. This time of shifting our priorities from a service perspective, so far we are still in a really good position to supply that to the communities, and we anticipate that will continue going forward.
Great, thank you. Harold, did you have questions from the Q&A or?
There are a ton of questions. I wanted to start with one first. We talked about how one neighborhood's changed their relationship with their management structure. Do you want to just give us a sense of what nature of the direction of your management structure you're emphasizing in light of this crisis, the property management structure? Your team concepts. Am I muted?
All right, trying to unmute. So we had been, prior to COVID, moving, taking advantage of technology opportunities that are available, particularly to nonprofits, to migrate our entire kind of shared library server-based into the internet and start to restructure how we communicate as teams within the organization. So much more moving away from a department-focused structure to a more building team-supported structure. So we have the ability within our network to build specific teams that we assign out to all the staff associated with that building, whether it be the resident services coordinator, the AP person, the site manager, the maintenance tech, the portfolio manager, the asset manager, and we're connected by these teams that could be building specific, which allows us to more fluidly address problems and also create more of a sense of community within the organization that's more project and resident specific as opposed to department driven. And again, taking advantage of resources that are available, like E3 licensing for Microsoft is very cheap for nonprofits. And so just taking advantage of those opportunities to build a better technology and communications culture, which again, with one of the opportunities within COVID has been accelerated within our organization because of the move to work from home.
Great. There are a bunch of questions online about approvals on replacement reserve, not paying reserve deposits, on various other modifications, and specifically questions whether anybody has heard of a HUD agreement to hold off on reserve payments. Any of the panelists have any experience more broadly with approvals in this area, either by HUD or by other lenders or investors? We are planning another webinar specifically on this subject. As you all probably know, lenders and investors are holding back, waiting to see how this will shake out. To some extent, we had hoped to do that kind of session a week ago, but people are not ready to go public with their views on this yet. We're hoping in a couple of weeks to have a couple of lenders and investors address this, because it's a really important subject. Any other thoughts on the panel about that? Approval set. Have you gotten any readings or inklings from other investors? Okay. There was a specific question on food resources. What kind of groups you reached out to? What kind of food security measures you have taken? Melissa?
Yeah, I'll feel that. There's a multitude of funders and opportunities and organizations within our area, groups like Meyer Memorial Trust and such that could potentially be interested in this. We're still pricing out the total scale of this to implement across the portfolio. We will be moving forward and have adequate funds within the building structures to address those updates where we need. They really are low cost individual by building, but start to add up as you move it across 3,000 units and 44 multifamily structures. However, pulling that data together and being able to reach out and make an ask is something that I think will be very compelling towards for funders that are interested in bringing equality and internet democracy to residents that are the most vulnerable, and providing them a communication outlet and tool to stay informed during crisis.
And Harold, just to, although I'm not a panelist, I can share some experiences that I've had with regard to your previous question about investors or syndicators. As many people on the call know, the National Equity Fund is a partnering organization of Local Initiative Support Corporation. I've had the opportunity to sit in on some regional asset management calls where the stability of the portfolio was looked at. And what I can tell you is that NEF is looking at the suspension of reserve payments and both on the operating and replacement side as strategies to stabilize cash flow. I can't say whether or not that's a corporate policy or if it's just being used in this case for portfolio modeling. But I think with regard to One Neighborhood Builders, where the at least one of those two entities, Villa Victoria, I believe, is syndicated through NEF. NEF, presumably agreed to the suspension of those payments, so I think it's probably in line with what's being discussed, anyways.
Great. It is a hot topic, and I do know that one of the other questions online was about whether or not you all have to stretch out your vendors at all on their payments. And I do know that at least a couple of the syndicators, before granting any kind of relief, actually want to see your complete list of payables and priorities of who you're paying and how. So getting really granular on your cash flow projected and the cash uses and potential stretch out of vendors is very much on the table. I'd like to just take a couple minutes now, again, repeat that the slides will be online. If you have specific questions, feel free to contact us to do follow-up. We will answer your questions specifically. But this is a big moment for CHAM. We are our membership. It's a free membership at this point because of the crisis. We hope that many of you, all of you, will become members. That enhances and builds the CHAM platform. We are launching the nuts and bolts, the first course in the CHAM curriculum online in mid-June. And at the same time, the conference, which we were forced to cancel, we are recasting as a webinar series, calling it Response and Resilience. We're going to call it Brunch with CHAM. They'll be like this, noontime, 1-hour sessions every couple weeks over the summer. We hope you'll join us with that. We hope we'll go to the new CHAM website, CHAM Online. We will be putting these materials and tools that are available, best practice items, on the new CHAM website, as well as building up our membership with you. Evaluations for this webinar will not come to you as an email. It will pop up to you as you leave. So we're going to ask you to please fill out another blasted damn evaluation survey, but they really, really are important to us. So we hope you'll take a couple minutes to complete that. It gives us an incredible amount of guidance moving forward. And with that, it is 1 p.m. I want to thank Antonio and Steve from One Neighborhood and Brian from Reed. You did a great job sharing this. Thank you, Jay, for moderating. And thank you all. Say
you're welcome.
And be well to all of you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Be well all.
Safe and healthy, everyone. Thank you.